One of the best ways to win chess games is by destroying your opponent's pawn structure. And in this video, we'll break down 2 powerful strategies to do this in your games, so you can start applying these immediately and hopefully win a bunch of games. Okay, let's get into it. Strategy number 1, doubling your opponent's pawns. The end goal of what we're trying to achieve by doubling our opponent's pawns is to create a series of weak pawns that we can attack and win, and that essentially leads us into a winning endgame where we have material advantage. So in this position, somewhere along the line in the game, white has induced black to capture most likely b takes c6, and that's led to a crippled pawn structure, doubled pawns on the c file, and that's essentially the only difference in the two sides' positions. And white takes advantage of that very quickly by playing rook c1, and then after something like rook to d8, we're going to take pawn number 1, and pawns 2 and 3 on a7 and c7 are going to be next to fall, and white's just going to simply win this game. So how do we get to this position to begin with? I'm going to show you the 2 most common ways we can induce double pawns into our opponent's positions and take advantage of them, and they are spotting the move bishop to g4, which pins the knight on f3 to the queen, and bishop b4, which pins the knight on c3 to the king. Usually, like you can see in this case, the knight on c3 is defending the pawn on e4, the central pawn, and in this case, the knight on f3 is defending the central d4 pawn. So in this first example, white has played h3, and we are going to take that knight, and white cannot play the move that he'd like to play, which is queen takes f3, which keeps the pawn structure intact, because we simply win the pawn on d4 and win the game. So to save the d4 pawn, white is forced to capture with the g pawn. And now we've crippled our opponent's pawn structure, we've doubled those f pawns, and after queen to f5, putting pressure on both of them, we have essentially a winning advantage in the game. Now, to be honest, this game probably won't make it out of the middle game because it's just so horrendous to have a crippled queenside pawn structure, and black's going to find a way to attack the king, put pressure on the h3 pawn, down the g file possibly, maybe the bishop's going to come out to d7, and knight could come h5, to f4, etc., etc. Black's going to win this game. Very, very likely win for black in the middle game. If white were to survive, then the same as this situation, black is going to have a whole heap of issues trying to defend pawns, double pawns, and this pawn on h3, which again, there's no other pawn in the position that can defend. These pawns cannot defend each other anymore. That's the punchline. Same with this example, we're going to take the knight on c3, just on the opposite side of the board. Now, the queen can't take because we're going to win that knight. The knight is going to take that pawn on e4, and we're going to win the game. It's a very crucial pawn. So we're forcing white to play b takes c3, and again in this position, as black, we're going to try trade as many pieces as we can and get down to an endgame and take advantage of these weak pawns. If we, while we're playing the middle game, white is going to have a lot of issues, A, defending the pawns, but B, just having something useful to do in the position, because the pawns can no longer be used well to gain space and gain an attack and all that kind of stuff, because they're very, very useless when they're doubled. Okay. There are exceptions, I've got to say, to double pawns, so I'm just going to cover a couple of exceptions. So in this case, we're white. We've just played a3. In this case, it's okay for our pawns to be doubled because what we're going to play soon is c takes d5, and after that, we have undoubled our pawns, and we've got this strong central pawn structure that is intact, very stable. And the second example, which is very common, is, bishop to b5 is the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish opening, very common. You guys have seen all the top grandmasters playing this opening. a6, and the main move is bishop to a4. Now, if we're trying to double our opponent's pawns, why don't we take on c6? Well, in this case, our opponent has two ways of capturing, d takes and b takes. Both of them, let's take a look at b takes c6, both of them lead to relatively stable pawn structures regardless of having double pawns. So let's say castles, d6, these pawns are very stable and very strong in the center, and it's not a weakness of any massive massive magnitude. Black has an open b file, put pressure on as well, and can play c5 or d5. So black is okay in this position, and likewise if black played d takes c6 after castles, bishop to d6, again these pawns, even though they're doubled on the c file, these set of four pawns, this pawn island, defends each other. These pawns defend each other very well, and then we've got another pawn island here. So black's position is very stable. So that's the exception. However, if for some reason black was missing that b pawn, now we end up with, again, that same doubled c pawn situation that cannot be defended by a b or a d pawn. So that's the key distinction there. Okay, so strategy number 2 is creating isolated pawns. Now, just so we can stay consistent with the examples, this is again a very similar example to this first situation. If I go back to the start, where we looked at double pawns. In this case, where are we? Here we are. We've got isolated pawns. So they're not doubled, but they are isolated. So the reason this is a winning strategy is, again, we're going to play rook c1 as white. And now, as soon as black defends that, I'm going to go rook to c6. Essentially, we're trying to put pressure on these two pawns because they can't defend each other, and that is our advantage. That's the imbalance. If I just take a couple moves back, this position is dead equal from every angle except for this queenside pawn structure. White's queenside pawns defend each other, black's do not. So fast forward to where we were, rook to c6. We're attacking that knight, so king to g7, and then we just swing across to a6. The rook swings across to defend the a7 pawn. And then after a couple of moves, knight e5, say knight e4, we're going to play knight to c6, and we're going to win that pawn very soon. Black is just defending. We're going to be up a pawn, and we're most likely going to have a winning game situation. So this is what we're essentially trying to aim for with isolated pawns. Again, we're trying to create pawns that cannot be defended by other pawns and that are weaknesses that we're going to try exploit and turn into a winning endgame. So how can we achieve this position from our middle games? The key thing you should be looking out for is when you're trading pieces and when you're trading pawns, you want to pay attention to the pawn structure at all times. Am I going to end up with a weak pawn structure? How can I induce a weak pawn structure in my opponent's position, etc., etc.? Those are the questions you want to be asking as you're considering your moves in the middle game. Now, we can't cover isolated pawns without covering an isolated d-pawn, which is one of the most common pawn structures in chess. And that arises essentially when you get your pawns out like this, and it doesn't have to be in this exact position. Usually in a queen's gambit position like this, the knights are out, bishops come out, kings have castled, but the pawn structure ends up like this regardless. And the key thing here is both sides can end up with an isolated d-pawn. And let's just quickly take a look at it. So c takes, black can take back with the queen, but black might decide to take back with the bishop, with the pawn. And once we trade and bishop takes c5, you see here, black has that isolated d-pawn, while white has the pawn on e3, which is very stable. Now, the key thing about isolated d-pawns, and I'm going to show you how to play it for a win as a side that doesn't have the isolated pawn. The key thing is it's a very fine balance between this being an advantage and this being a weakness. And I would say if you are below 15 or 1600 maybe even below 1800, you should avoid having an isolated pawn full stop, because you're probably not going to be strong enough to understand the nuances of the attacking dynamic play that's required to make the most of having an isolated d pawn. In saying that, you want to be the side that that doesn't have the isolated d pawn but is playing against it. And so how we play against it is what I'm going to show you now. We can either, there's two plans, we can either pressure the isolated d pawn, or we can play for the square in front of the isolated d pawn. Those are the two ways to win this as white in this case. So we either want to put a knight on d4 and make the most of that outpost, or try to put pressure on the pawn and win the pawn outright. One key difference I'm going to show you next position is this. And if I go back, the only difference is the knight is either on b3 or c3. Pretty cool how it bounces around, eh? So my preference is put your knight on b3. And the reason is that's going to allow you to put your knight on d4. And after takes, we end up with a strong knight outpost on d4. What we're trying to achieve with this is we're going to trade pieces down until we get a situation similar to this. And this is the end game we're trying to trade down into, where we've traded queens, we've traded pieces, we've traded a set of rooks, we have control of the c file, and we've got a knight on d4. And after the rook penetrates, our opponent's going to defend that pawn on b7. We simply have a winning advantage because the bishop on e6 is dead. It's just defending the pawn on d5. The rook is tied up to the defense of the queenside pawns, and the king is stuck on the back rank by that rook on c7. And what we're simply going to do is play h4, maybe up to h6. We're going to start marching our king into the game. This is what we're trying to do. Once the king comes into the game and comes into black's position, it's just a matter of time before we start gobbling up some of the pawns and winning the game from there. But all of this came from recognizing, take a step back, that what we want to do is put a knight in front of that isolated d pawn, because there's no c pawn or e pawn to challenge our knight. And instead of putting a knight to c3, we have maneuvered it from d2 to b3 and then moved it to d4. And that's the key way to play against this isolated d pawn. If the colors were reversed, which is often the case, often white might have the isolated d pawn like this, just depending on how the pawns get traded. Then black is going to, again, similarly probably play knight to d7, knight to b6, and then knight to d5, and the game goes on that way. So just to summarize this video, what we want to do is win games by destroying our opponent's pawn structure, and we do that by doubling our opponent's pawns or creating isolated pawns, and then using those as weaknesses so that when we trade our pieces, we get into a winning endgame and win the pawns and then win the game. So I hope you guys took something out of this video. Apply these strategies to your games and let me know how you go in the comments below. Peace out. We'll see you in the next video.